So with all complex question fallacies, you should be able to identify the two questions that have been combined into one. And of course, as I just mentioned, the best way to respond to this sort of trickery is to separate the question back out into the two original questions and answer each separately. To go back to another theme we've discussed, someone might know that I believe in God, and he'll say, is it difficult to believe in something that's totally unsupported? Well, if I say yes, then I'm agreeing that belief in God is totally unsupported by the evidence. If I say no, then I'm saying, yeah, belief in God is totally unsupported by the evidence, and I have no problem believing it. And so, again, this is a complex question. There are two separate issues. Is it difficult to believe in God? And is belief in God totally unsupported by the evidence? The complex question combines the two, and unless you notice that two questions have been combined into one, and take the time to separate them out and give two separate answers, if this happens in a debate or in a courtroom, you could be giving other people the impression that you endorse that assumption or that presumptive fact that has been snuck in to the enterprise, right? So, is it difficult to believe in something totally unsupported? I'll say, first of all, it's not difficult to believe in God, and secondly, it is supported by the evidence, and that's how you would deal with the complex question. Okay, the next fallacy is the false dichotomy. With the false dichotomy, the arguer tries to force us to choose between only two alternatives, and the arguer makes one of the alternatives look horrible. And so it's a way of forcing us to accept his position. Right? So the false dichotomy says you either have to choose between A or B. A is horrible, so you're going to have to accept B. Well, the reason this is a fallacy is it's a false dichotomy. Right? There aren't only those two choices. There are 3 or 4 or 5 possibilities. And those other possibilities may be better than either one that the arguer is putting forward. So for instance, someone might say, either defeat Obama in this campaign or prepare for tyranny. Well, there's only 2 options. It's either tyranny or defeat Obama. Maybe there are other possibilities, right? Maybe Obama might get elected as he was, and things are okay, right? There is no tyranny. It is not the end of America as we know it. So this was a false dichotomy. It's based on fear, and it's trying to suggest there's only 2 options, A or B. A, or in this case B, is horrible, therefore you should choose A, right? We don't want tyranny, therefore we must defeat Obama. But the way the argument's set up is fallacious, because there are more than just those 2 possibilities. Another example might be something like this. Look, the choice is simple: close the borders or lose prosperity. Right? Now, there might be an argument to be made for that all different sorts of immigration reform would be helpful to our country in terms of cohesiveness and prosperity. But that is not a good argument for that position. Either close the borders or lose prosperity. Right? Closing the borders, that's a radical position. Actually close the borders so nobody can come into America. That's kind of outrageous. Losing prosperity, that's terrible too. Well, the way you answer a false dichotomy is saying, here's a 3rd possibility. Here's a 4th possibility. Here's some intelligent immigration reform that will make our country richer, socially and culturally and politically, as well as economically. Right? So to respond to the false dichotomy, you should be able to identify a 3rd and or a 4th or 5th alternative to the 2 that are being, I just went like 4 or 3, to the 2 that are being offered by the arguer. Okay, now our next fallacy is called the fallacy of suppressed evidence. In some ways, it's similar to begging the question, especially the version where we leave out a key premise. The difference between begging the question and suppressed evidence is this. With begging the question, the arguer leaves out a key premise that is controversial. It's actually the very meat of the issue, and it's a controversial fact that most people will be familiar with, right? So, with begging the question, when I said murderers should be put to death, therefore abortionists should be put to death, we're aware of the fact that a lot of people believe that abortion is murder, right? So it's no mystery, and it is a very controversial issue. With suppressed evidence, the argument looks convincing only because a certain bit of evidence or a premise has been left out. But the premise is something that is likely to be unknown to the hearer of the argument, and it is something that is non-controversial. Right? So you can look it up and it's a definite fact, but this thing has been left out of the argument. So suppressed evidence happens when there's some important evidence that's really relevant to the conclusion that is left out of the picture. That evidence is relatively non-controversial if people just knew about it, but the hearer of the argument or the reader of the argument might not be aware of it. So let me give you a couple examples. Harold Shipman has 20 years experience as a nurse. We should hire him at our hospital. All right? It's not a bad argument. You might need to hear a little bit more, but it looks okay at first, right? Harold Shipman, he's got 20 years experience as a nurse. Well, maybe we should hire him at our hospital. We could use nurses, right? However, there's suppressed evidence in this argument. Harold Shipman is, or was, a mass murderer from Great Britain. He did work as a nurse, and he used his opportunities in the nursing field to kill people who were his patients. And so he killed dozens of patients over that 20-year period of time. So when I add that information into the argument, suddenly the conclusion does not follow at all. So with suppressed evidence, we've got some other fact that the hearer might not know about. When that fact comes to life, then we feel completely differently about the conclusion. So if the argument originally were Harold Shipman has 20 years experience as a nurse, and in those 20 years he killed 36 of his patients, therefore we should hire him at our hospital, we wouldn't be inclined at all to believe that conclusion, right? But when you leave out that second premise, that he killed all those people, when you suppress that evidence, then the argument looks reasonable. And so that's the nature of suppressed evidence. Anytime that you think this fallacy could be suppressed evidence, you should be able to identify what the suppressed facts are. And that's what I just did with the Harold Shipman case. The suppressed fact here was that he was a mass murderer. Once we add that information in, we're not at all inclined to hire him to work at our hospital. Okay, another example of suppressed evidence. Let's say you're looking for a car, and you say, wow, this car is just as nice as the other one. It costs $2,000 less. Therefore, we'll save money by buying this car. Right? So this car's just as nice. It costs $2,000 less. Let's save some money and buy this one. It sounds like a decent kind of argument, until you learn some more information. This car that costs $2,000 less gets 17 miles to the gallon. This one that costs $2,000 more gets 45 miles per gallon. And if you had known that information, you would not be so hasty to conclude that the car with the lower sticker price is really going to be the car that is less expensive for you to own, right? So an argument that has suppressed evidence looks reasonable at first glance until some more pertinent information is added. When we add that pertinent information, the conclusion no longer looks supported. And that's the nature of suppressed evidence. And again, the difference between that and begging the question, the version of begging the question where we leave out a key premise, is that the premise being left out in begging the question is a controversial premise, and it's a fact that's fairly well known, right? The suppressed evidence is a premise that's not at all controversial. It's just an issue that the hearer might not know about it. And so that's the key difference between the two kinds of fallacy.